Hey everyone, my name is Ricardo Avila. Let me ask you something. Does your heart race when you hear great music? I thought so. Does your heart ache when you hear a compelling story? I know it does. I also know your heart is going to love listening to the PC Music Diary. Your favorite Popping Collars hosts, maybe a surprise guest star or two, reveal the songs that have had the biggest impact on their lives through heartwarming, heartbreaking, and heartfelt stories. So listen to your heart and check out the PC Music Diary on the Popping Collars feed, wherever you get your podcasts. Pop, pop goes the heart rate.
Everyone, my name is Greg Knight, and I like watching, thinking about, and talking about movies. One of the great things about starting your own podcast is that there are some days when you actually get to talk to the creators of those movies. This is one of those days. This month, I got the chance to talk to Andrew Kightlinger, the director of a new film called Lost on a Mountain in Maine. Letterboxd.com will tell you, quote, when 12-year-old Don Findler gets tired of waiting for his father and brothers to join him on the summit of Maine's highest peak, he decides to find his own way back to camp. But Don doesn't count on a fast-moving fog that obscures the path. He doesn't count on falling down an embankment that hides him from sight. And he doesn't count on taking a turn that leaves him alone to wander aimlessly for nearly 2 weeks in the empty mountain wilderness. End quote. What I'll tell you is that this is a story of perseverance and survival that's shown in a much more stoic way than you would typically see with a movie like this. It leans more into cinema verite than it does melodrama. And that's an interesting choice for a young filmmaker looking to make a mark on this type of storytelling. So what happens when a director makes a survival movie for Sylvester Stallone's production company that's based on a true story? That's quite the word salad. Find out as I keep things under the stole with Andrew Kightlinger. But before we chat, here's a trailer for the film.
This hike, it's no picnic. Treacherous terrain, takes a whole day.
Sure, some crummy old mountains that are fishing for 2 weeks sounds just swell.
Well, you don't have to go. The world is not going to give them a break. Neither should I. There she is, Mount Katahdin.
We're gonna hike there?
Sure, you're almost men now. Don, slow down.
You want us to be men? Then let us be men. We don't need you. We're going to the top.
We need to stick together! I can't find the trail!
Where's Don?
Where's your brother?
There's 100,000 acres of wilderness out there. So focused. I'm trying to make him tough. I forgot to be his dad. Just hope to God we get one more chance.
We need volunteers. As many as you can send.
Hey! Come over here!
Do you think our son is dead?
I always told him, when things get tough, press on.
Your brother is really stubborn.
Press on.
I always like to start these conversations, especially with directors that may be new to folks. What was the moment or what was the event that happened in your life that made you think, this is what I want to do? I want to make movies.
Great. I love that question. I'll try to make the answer not long because there's a story behind it. But I was 5 years old and I saw E.T. for the first time. So that was that moment where you're like, okay, whatever this feeling is that this movie has conjured up in my soul, I want to be a part of that creation in the future, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And then the longer version of it is I was born and raised in Madagascar, so I was a missionary kid, Lutheran missionaries. My parents were doctors, and they worked in the villages a lot, so they'd be in very remote areas. And we did have a TV and a VHS player, and there was this footlocker that had a trove of VHS tapes that would travel from missionary family to missionary family and stay with the family for months at a time, because to even drive 100 miles in Madagascar can take days because of how road infrastructure is, or there is no road. And so that footlocker became my film education, and it had movies like E.T., The Goonies, White Fang, The Black Stallion, Empire of the Sun, all the movies that this movie is meant to emulate.
Right.
So that's kind of how I was like, this, and then there's little movies along the way that, Run Flew to the Cuckoo's Nest showed me how you can make a character drama. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. And Lord of the Rings showed me how to weave character drama into spectacle. Like, oh, I can do that, So there are definitely movies along the way that were signposts for me and led me to where I am now.
See, that's fascinating, because I can imagine that if you have experience traveling all over doing this missionary work, you're probably just thinking in terms of story anyway, because you're sort of moving around through these different cultures, through these different stories, right?
Yeah, I've actually never heard it put that way, but yes, absolutely. I think my childhood to many is a weird story and a weird movie in a weird way. I kind of take it for granted, but absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me curious. So was this like a script that was already kind of floating around, or was this something that you were part of the creative process of like writing, forming the story for?
No, so this was incubated in Sylvester Stallone's company, Balboa Productions, and obviously Stallone is the OG underdog. He's Rocky, and so his perspective is always trying to find films that are about human perseverance and the triumph of the human spirit. And he'd never done one focused on child before. So they kind of made it in-house. They had a writer named Luke Paradise who adapted this book. And then I was selected through an interview process, which at first was very boring. Just, talking heads talking about my vision, leadership, yada, yada, yada. But then finally, after about 3 months of interviews, culminated with me being flown out for my final test to northern Maine and hiking the titular mountain. And that hike is known as the hardest non-technical day hike in America. It's not easy. It's 6 hours straight up, like just doing the stair stepper for 6 hours. But I got the deal memo literally like 3 days after crashing. So that's how I came into it. And when I came into it as well, again, I mentioned like this movie reminded me of the films that I grew up with.
Yeah.
These children films that are for children, but also work on an adult level, talk down to kids. And so I wanted that was what appealed to me about making it.
And children's films that put children in situations that are comparable to like an adult situation where they have to grow up quickly, right? Whether it's a story of survival or a story of found family or a story of like, deep friendship, like you have to kind of live beyond your years a little bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And on top of that, the father-son aspect of this appealed to me as well. I have a great relationship with my father. But I saw an opportunity here to explore sort of like male vulnerability in a way. And this idea that here are these two people that just don't know how to say I love you to each other, but through this kind of heightened ordeal, they find a way to do that. And I thought that was a pure kind of universal message.
I love the missionary story because that helps me sort of understand what it was that maybe drew you to this project. There's a storytelling device that you employ in this movie, which is almost like documentary footage. It's the interview footage that you intersperse in. Were you able to meet the folks that, is that footage that you filmed, or is that footage that you found from like news footage or something?
Yeah, great question. No, unfortunately, I never got to meet those people. I never even got to meet Don Fendler himself, the boy. He lived till he was 90, till 2016, so he only died recently. But that was archival footage that was filmed in the 80s.
Okay.
These two documentarians. And one of our producers, Derek Desmond, who's been on this project for over a decade, even before the Stallone years, as they were trying to get the story told, they just had 45 hours of interview footage with all these people.
Wow.
And it was a lot of it. And in the editing process, we asked ourselves, like, okay, why is this movie special? Like, well, what do we want audiences to take away from this? And it was only in post-production that as the editor was cutting the film itself, I was in the background on a laptop going through this doc footage and finding these little moments that I thought these could be chapter headings that help ground our movie and remind people that this actually happened, and that the things that they might think are unbelievable, especially like near the end of the movie when it kind of feels like it's almost a Hollywood production,
Right.
a Hollywood tale. No, these things actually happened. So yeah, and I love, Warren Beatty's Reds is one of my favorite movies, and he employs the tactic in it. So I thought, if he can do it, I can.
It's cool because it gives the characters sort of almost like an inner monologue, because it shows the motivation for what it is that they're doing at that particular time of the story, especially Don. And I thought it was very clever to save Don's interview until the end of the film, because it's like, there's a tension there with this story.
I had to fight for that, because there's a version of this movie that has a lot of him talking through the whole film, and I'm like, no, we need to save him. That'll be for the audience.
I am curious about stories like this when you're putting together, a film that's based on a real life events like this movie is. There can be, let me say, this desire from audience goers to, once they hear the premise for the story, or once they see the trailer, do the Wikipedia search of like, oh, what's happening here? And so it's like, when you're telling the story, how do you set the movie up to have that sort of level of tension where you want to follow the characters and see the story unfold, versus knowing that maybe some people are coming in already informed as to what's going to happen?
What a great question that nobody's asked me yet. Okay, so obviously, I think most audiences know it's a PG-rated family movie, so the kid's probably going to make it out in the end, right? But for me, the tension lies in the dynamic you set up with the family at the beginning. You make the audience, the tension is built in. Oh, we want this son and this father to have a meeting of the minds. I always say that this movie is about a boy who just wants a hug from his dad. And like, we want that. So that's where the tension's built in, I think, is we want them we want the dad to say, I love you to him,
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the tension is.
Yeah. Building off of that, one of the characters that I dialed in on was Ruth, right? Played by Caitlin Fitzgerald. Talk me through how you work with that actor, because there's a way of doing that part in an actorly way, which is like, showing the emotion on the face and stuff. And yet the way that it's played, it's so reserved. And then when you see the interviews with the actual Ruth, you're like, oh, okay, she seems like she would be this kind of reserved person. But like, there's a lot of shocking news that's delivered to Ruth in this movie, and she subtly plays it, right? So like, what's the conversation that you're having to get that performance?
Well, my entry point for that character, because I did definitely put my own stamp on her once I got the job. She's a reflection of the women that raised me. She's my grandmother. 96. She's my mother, she's my aunts who helped raise me. It's no mistake that the first thing she does as a character in the movie is rip off her apron. Like that was something that appealed to Caitlin. Like, oh, this is going to be a woman who is tending the garden. That's her family. And she cuts her son's hair, even though he doesn't need it, to make sure that she's keeping the garden going, and that appealed to her. She made fun of me for that imagery a lot. When I'm like, tend the garden, she's like, oh, Andrew, okay, Stanislavski. But no, she came on. Caitlin is from Maine, so she had a connection to the story inherently. She actually met Don Fendler as a kid in school, which is kind of cool. But I wanted to represent a woman who wasn't just like crying in a kitchen, especially like period film. I just think that's so tired, and we've been there before. And she was up to the task of just giving the mom the most agency in the movie, and she's the one that's just trying to keep these guys together, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, again, like almost having one of my probably my favorite moment in the film is when she has this cosmic connection with her son, where she's lying on the bed on the pillow and she's wondering what he's doing. And then they kind of see each other without seeing each other. And that was part of it too. Like she's the glue. And oftentimes mothers are, especially back then.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, there's that one line that she has, and the reason that I asked that question is because that line just stuck with me. That when Don goes missing, and they report back to her that one of the sons is missing, and she says, "Which one?" You know, it's just like really haunting.
Yeah, we almost cut that from the film, and I'm glad we didn't. Like there are some people arguing, "Oh, cut that." I'm like, no, no, no. That's how she thinks. That's how she
Yeah,
operates.
yeah,
You're right. Yeah,
yeah.
and you're right. The real version, the real Ruth, and Caitlin didn't get to see any of the footage of the real Ruth, so she had
Mhm.
no idea that she was basically, you know, the Don's descendants have seen the film, like, oh my gosh, she captured the essence, you know? Yeah.
I'm glad that you set up the dynamic of how the Balboa productions were, you know, this sort of story of like, you know, overcoming odds and stuff. And obviously we can relate that to like the Rocky narrative and all of that stuff. I'm wondering when you get that assignment of like, you've got a boy lost in the woods. He's trying to survive to get back home. There's a way of telling that story that can feel very after school special. And there's a way of telling that story that can feel honest and like a struggle. So when you're going about putting this film together, is there pressure to lean into the, I don't know, the uplifting aspects of the story rather than sort of play like, no, Don is actually struggling here and let's show some of that?
I think I was hired because I pitched to them, let's make a movie that's both broad and appealing, but also artful.
Yeah.
And that is my approach. Those are the movies that I like that speak to me the most. E.T. is a movie that doesn't talk down to its audience, but it's still very broad. And this movie, I mean, I copied the ending of E.T. This movie ends with a symphony of music for the last like 8 minutes, right? And that's by design. It literally ends on a close up with a kid, just like E.T. There's a point there, and I wanted to manipulate audiences, but I need to also earn that last 10 minutes. And all that comes down to, I think, exploring everything in a very human way, in a very grounded way. And whether the audience knows it or not, there are Tarkovsky references littered throughout the film. There's, one of my favorite films. I'm literally looking at the posters. Nicholas Rowe's Walkabout. That was an access point for me as well, because that movie doesn't have spectacle in it. It's just kids being kids and surviving. And so I don't think that broad filmmaking and artful filmmaking have to be mutually exclusive.
I agree with you, and that's why it can be frustrating, like especially in, gosh, you think about like faith-based movies and stuff like that that sort of lean more into the agenda than the story. You know, it's like, do we really need to do that?
And I think it's counterintuitive for those movies, because what you're doing is you're actually pushing people away. And the faith aspects of this movie, growing up as a missionary kid, I saw how different faiths could find a way to meet. Madagascar is half Muslim, half Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's no tension there. They all coexist. So why can't a movie that has faith elements, I think the less you try to beat people over the head with it, the less agenda driven it is, actually, the better your message can pull through, which is be kind and love thy neighbor, which is definitely part of what this movie's about. Help your neighbors. Mm-hmm. And Martin Scorsese makes religious movies.
Mm-hmm. All of his movies.
Yeah. Tree of Life to me is one of the most life-affirming movies I've ever seen.
Yeah.
It's not doing it in this overt way. I mean, maybe it is, but yeah. So to me, like, the religious aspects of this film are meant to be kind of poetry and meant to, kind of grow out of the nature around it. And, and there's no reason we can't do stuff like that in a movie that's for kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they give context to the characters, which I think is really nice. So I've only got a few more minutes, and gosh, I hate to end on a technical question, but I'm just really curious about it, which is that you filmed this on location, right? Like in the woods.
Yes. So we did a combo things. We filmed a lot of it in upstate New York in the Catskills.
Okay.
Tax incentives, boring stuff. But also we filmed a lot of it in Maine as well. So for example, like the mountaintop sequences in the movie, I definitely wanted to lean into the practical nature of things, mostly because it harkens back to those movies I grew up with. I also think it looks better.
Yeah.
And so the mountain stuff is both a built set where we built an 80-foot by 80-foot replica of the peak on a soundstage.
Okay.
And we pummeled the actors with rain and all this stuff. And the poor kids, they had a great time. One of them was like, I hate this, but I know deep down they loved it. And then also we took a crew and climbed the mountain with 60 pounds of camera equipment. Like I had an RE Alexa in my backpack and climbed the peak of the mountain in a storm to also capture the authenticity of Maine. I wanted to make sure that we weren't one of those movies that was accused of just shooting the whole thing somewhere else. So we went up there and we were up to our necks in water sometimes, filming in rivers and trying to, I'm a wilderness guy, so I wanted the movie to feel immersive that way. So it's a combo of everything. But we were out in the wild for shooting most of us.
Yeah, and that comes through. When you were talking about shipping all that stuff up there, it made me think of like Wrath of Aguirre or something, just transporting all of this stuff across the mountain.
Trust me, every time the producers I lobbied to shoot, I was like, we got to shoot in the wilderness. The producers were like, okay, Werner Herzog.
That's right. But the reason that I wanted to ask is because if you shoot in the woods, just like the story of your movie conveys, like that's giving up a lot of control to the elements, right? Like you don't know what's going to happen and what you can shoot and when you can shoot and how all of that's going to go. So as a filmmaker, what does it feel like to give up control to the elements like that?
I think it's freeing.
Oh.
I think it's freeing, and you allow yourself, the cinematographer is going to obsess over the light, and I'm like, that doesn't matter. I think like James Cameron always says, like, continuity be damned. Like Titanic, the most continuity. And I think I agree. If your story works fundamentally, the audience is not thinking about all that stuff. So if the light changes, whatever, we were blessed with good weather on this movie. Whenever we had bad weather, we sought it out. Either we fabricated it or we said, oh, there's going to be a storm on Mount Katahdin on Tuesday. Let's hike it.
Yeah.
So we were blessed in that sense. But when there was bad weather, we just kind of ran with it. Because to me, filmmaking, I'm a scholar of movies from the 70s.
Yeah.
I wasn't born then, but because those movies felt made, quote unquote, they felt tactile. And I love that. I just love that. Because to me, we're still artists. Paintings, there's splotches and there's goop. And I think movies should feel the same way. Movies have too much of a veneer now. It's like, no offense to Netflix, but sometimes the movies just feel too perfect.
I so agree with you. we are so in agreement on that. Andrew, thank you so much for doing this interview. Where can people find Lost on a Mountain in Maine? Is it in theaters now?
Going to be in theaters this Friday nationwide. We're opening up just shy of 1,000 screens, which is pretty great for an independent film.
Awesome.
So look it up on all your apps and web. You can just Google it. Go to our website. You can find tickets there. And then you can find me on andrew.vhs at Instagram. I'll also be updating people on where you can find it. And it'll be streaming eventually as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
This was a pleasure.